Special Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, June 19th, 2019. And with that, I will have a call to order, please.
Commissioner Kelso Barnett.
Here.
Commissioner O'Neill.
Here.
Commissioner Willander.
Here.
Chair Felder.
Here.
Commissioner McDonald.
Here.
Commissioner Barbose.
Here.
And Commissioner Larry Barnett.
Present.
And could I have Commissioner McDonald lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the
flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Again, I want to thank you for your patience for the delay in starting the meeting, but we wanted to make sure that everyone that had a chance to attend would have that opportunity. A couple of things, please. If you have cell phones or other devices that make noise, put them on silent mode so they don't disturb the meeting. And just a reminder for those of you that may not be aware, the third of our town halls on housing our community is going to take place tomorrow evening at the Vintage House from 6 to 9 p.m. And we would encourage any and all of you to please participate if you're able to. One other thing, because this is a special meeting, members of the public will have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission on the item that's on our agenda tonight when we open that for public comment, but no other items may be discussed at this meeting. Is there any review or changes to the agenda? Seeing none. Late correspondence? None. With that, then, we will move right on to the item on the for discussion tonight, which is a discussion opportunity to provide comments regarding the scope and contents of a draft EIR for the proposed Parkview Senior Residential Care Facility and Multi-Family Residential Project. And with that, I'll turn it over to staff. Christina.
Thank you so much.
Chair Felder?
Yes.
I need to recuse myself due to proximity.
Thank you.
Chair Felder, I am also choosing to recuse myself. Nobody has asked me to. I want to make that clear. And I am outside the 500-foot limit, but there is a new ruling from the FPPC that involves properties owners between 500 and 1,000 feet. And I just want to read that and just make sure that people realize this is a one-time decision to recuse myself, and we'll be waiting for a ruling from the FPPC. For decisions involving property located between 100 and 1,000 feet from the official's property, whether the decision creates a disqualifying conflict now depends on a number of factors. Under amended regulation 18702.2, such a decision will be deemed to have a material disqualifying impact on the official's property interest if it would change the public official's properties, development potential, income producing potential, highest and best use, or market value, or if it would change the property's character by substantially altering traffic levels, intensity of use, parking view, privacy, noise levels, or air quality. So at this time, I'm choosing to recuse myself, and this is a one-time decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
Back to me.
Let's just give her a chance to leave the room.
Okay.
Okay, Christina, take it away.
All right, this doesn't seem to be loading, but we will get started anyway. I just wanted to welcome everyone here tonight. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evenings to be here. It really is so important that your voices are heard in this process early and that you help us inform the environmental impact process, so thank you very much. Oh, this is really not working. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce everyone who's up here tonight. My name is Christina Tierney. I'm an associate planner for the City of Sonoma. And beside me is Catherine Waugh from DUDEC, who is the consultant who's been hired to prepare the environmental impact report. And next to Catherine is Kathy Peace, who's a consultant to the city, who is the planner for the project. Oh, thank you. And I will turn it over to Catherine for the rest of the presentation. Okay. Actually, before you get started, I just wanted to remind everyone that the focus of tonight is for the environmental impact report. There are no decisions being made tonight. It's really just an opportunity for the public to have, sorry. This is really an opportunity for the public to speak on the scope of the environmental review. It is not about the merits of the project. Thank you.
Can you advance the slides? Sorry. All right, good evening, planning commissioners. As Christina said, my name is Catherine Waugh. I work with DUDEC. We're a consulting firm that specializes in preparation of CEQA documents, as well as a host of other technical services. So we have a brief agenda here that Christina's gone over a little bit in terms of the purpose of the scoping meeting, which I'll say a little bit more about the CEQA process and the typical contents of a draft EIR. And then I'll give a quick overview of the proposed project, and then a little bit more in detail about what we're so far planning as to have as the scope of the EIR, and then that helps inform the public to provide comments as to particular environmental issues that they're concerned about. So CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. In a nutshell, it is a state law that requires that state and local agencies and special districts are aware of the environmental effects of a project before that agency decides to move forward with a project or issue approvals for a project. In addition to being a disclosure effort in terms of making sure that the decision makers and the public are aware of those environmental effects, CEQA requires that the lead agency adopt any feasible mitigation measures or project alternatives that could substantially lessen any of a project's significant environmental effects. The main or the most common document to provide that disclosure in and to consider mitigation measures and alternatives is an environmental impact report. The report is divided up into the different topics that are required to be evaluated under CEQA, and we identify in each topic the impacts of a particular project. We consider whether or not those impacts are significant or could be considered less than significant. Where they are significant impacts, we look for mitigation measures that can reduce those impacts. And we also look at project alternatives that could involve modifications to a project design or sometimes a substantial revision to a project design. Project alternatives should still be capable of meeting most of the basic project objectives, but the idea is to try and find some way that we can modify a project and reduce or avoid some of the significant environmental effects. If an EIR if a lead agency finds that the EIR is adequate and complete, then the lead agency may certify the EIR and at that time decide whether or not to approve the project. If a project is approved subject to a certified EIR, then the lead agency also has to adopt a document that outlines how the mitigation measures in that EIR will be implemented and monitored for their, for the fact that they've been implemented and for their effectiveness. So as Christina mentioned, the purpose of the scoping meeting is to really focus on the environmental issues that the project raises so that we can make sure that the EIR that comes to the city's decision-making bodies is complete and adequately addresses the issues that are of most concern to the community. So it's not intended tonight that we get into the details of the project and the merits of the project. That is a discussion that the city would entertain once the EIR is completed. So instead, we really want to focus tonight on the physical environmental changes that the project could result in and what concerns the community may have in those realms so that we can make sure that those issues are addressed in this EIR. So this is a quick summary of the project site, and I'm going to pull up my notes because I can't read all those little letters. Not much better on my printed version, but so the project is about a 2.6 acre site. It is located on 1st Street East with the 3 different addresses of 216, 226, and 254. The site has a lot of trees, which we'll show you on the next slide. You can see an aerial view. Thank you, Kathy. The site contains several buildings. 2 of them are residential structures, and then there are some commercial structures on the southern portion of the property, which the commercial structures total about 17,500 square feet. The surrounding land uses include single-family residence and then multifamily development to the north. The Vintage House Senior Center is adjacent along the southern boundary of the property. To the east are multifamily development, the Meadow Gardens area, and then to the west are the baseball fields and Depot Park. So the next slide here shows the aerial view of the project. You can see the Vintage House is right along the bottom edge of this photograph. Excuse me. You can see the baseball fields, and so the proposed project site is directly across from those baseball fields and from Vintage House, up basically to the what do you call the inside of the baseball? Sorry, the infield. Thank you. Yes, I'm not a baseball player. So that shows you the property. The majority of it is already developed with the structures that I mentioned, but there is a vacant portion of it at the back, just north of Vintage House. So what is proposed on this site is an 80-bed facility that's proposed as a senior residential care facility. It would be composed of 80 dwelling units, but they don't include a kitchen. So there would be a communal kitchen, communal dining room, and a commercial kitchen to provide the food service. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, apparently some of the units may include some kitchen or kitchenette facilities. But there would also be other on-site amenities to provide services that would be needed by the residents of the facility. There is also a proposal to construct 27 multifamily dwelling units, and these would be apartments. There they would be divided up into 5 different structures, and on-site parking would be provided for both the the residential care facility and the multifamily apartments. The apartments themselves would be small format, and that would help to meet some of the city's affordable housing needs. The existing structures would be demolished, and many of the trees that are existing on the site are proposed to be removed. This is a rendering that shows the view of some of the project buildings and how it would look from First Street. And then this is more of the senior residential care facility. And this site plan shows you again that Vintage House is along the right-hand side of the photo of the site plan. The residential care facility would be in the southern portion of the project, and then the multifamily residential apartments would be on the northern side of the project site. So as I mentioned, there are in terms of the environmental impact report, there are certain topics that CEQA requires that we consider. Some of the topics, though, we are able to tell from our initial review of the project that we don't expect there to be any significant impacts. And so these are described in the notice of preparation as topics that we would focus out of the EIR, meaning that we would not prepare a standalone chapter to address these 3 topics. So as you can see, it includes agriculture and forestry. Although the project site does include a lot of trees, it's not considered forest land as defined under CEQA and Public Resources Code. There were past agricultural uses on the site, but it has not been actively used for agriculture in a long time, and it is not zoned or designated under the general plan for any agricultural or forestry activities. The site is not known to support any mineral resources. There's no known mineral recovery activities in the vicinity. Mineral resources is one of the topics you most often see focused out of an EIR because it really is not applicable in a lot of cities and more heavily developed counties. And then geology and soils is another one that, the site is relatively flat. There's no risk of landslide. There's no particular risk that's any different at this site than elsewhere in the city in terms of seismic activity or seismic hazards. And those are all issues that the state building code addresses quite thoroughly, and so there's nothing unique about this site that would require anything beyond what's required under the building code to ensure adequate safety in terms of seismic risk and geologic hazards. So that's another topic that we would expect to focus out of the EIR. This slide lists all of the different topics that we do expect we would need to analyze in more detail in the EIR. And I don't want to spend a lot of time going over every single topic. I'm happy to answer questions if folks have in terms of what our approach would be. But I would mention that for most of these topics, we will prepare a site-specific and project-specific technical study. So there will be a detailed traffic analysis prepared. There will be detailed biological resources and cultural and historic resources reports prepared. We will do modeling using the industry standard tools for air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. And we will, similar approach for noise and these other topics that require a lot of technical analysis. And then we evaluate those impacts based on the city's adopted policies and standards, as well as any applicable statewide or federal policies and standards that may relate to a particular issue.
Can you go back? I'd like to mention that historic resources I know are of concern, and I just wanted to mention that this project, the EIR consultant will be doing a new standalone historic resources technical report as part of the project.
So then we just have a couple of slides to outline the CEQA process so people know what to expect as we move forward with this. So right now we're in the first phase, which is the notice of preparation. That was the brief document that the city released for public review, and it is available through July 15th for folks to submit comments on. Again, this is we're looking for the community's input as to what environmental issues are of most concern, where people foresee an environmental impact occurring, and so then we can make sure that we evaluate those and find appropriate mitigation measures where needed. So the NOP provides a brief project summary and outlines, basically what we've just gone over in terms of what we expect the scope of the EIR to be. And in addition to having that circulated locally for the local community, it was also sent to the state clearinghouse, which is responsible for distributing the document to state agencies that may have jurisdiction over one or more resources within the project site. So then the next step is to prepare the draft EIR. This slide lists the key contents of the EIR. So we always first need to define the existing conditions in the vicinity, and that is sort of our baseline from which we evaluate whether an impact is a significant change compared to that baseline or not. We summarize regulatory framework, as I mentioned, state, local, countywide, and citywide policies and standards, as well as state and federal regulations that may apply to project implementation and how we carry out the environmental analysis. And those regulatory guidance is where we draw the significance criteria. So these are specific statements that help us define how you know whether an impact is significant or less than significant. And we use those thresholds to then disclose to the public and the decision makers what the impacts are, and where we identify a significant impact, we will find or evaluate mitigation measures and alternatives that may help to reduce or avoid those impacts. Once the draft EIR is complete, it's made available for a 45-day public review period, and then we welcome comments from the public and from agencies asking, typically those are comments where perhaps someone disagrees with the conclusions that were reached or the steps that we did went through to reach those conclusions, or requesting clarification on some of the analysis and content of the draft EIR. And we use those comments to then prepare the final EIR. So the final EIR will include all written comments, and then we provide a summary of verbal comments. So typically the draft EIR will be presented to the Planning Commission at another session similar to this one, and so that people have a chance to make comments in person to you. When we prepare responses to those comments, if we find that there's a theme, say we have 20 comments that all talk about one particular intersection or one particular environmental resource, for example, the historic significance of the buildings on site, then we use what we call a master response so that we can provide a real comprehensive look at that issue. And then we also provide individual responses to each individual comment. There are times when we need to make revisions to the draft EIR, such as to clean up any language that maybe was confusing or needed some clarification, or there's always at least one typo that someone finds that we will correct, so that then you have a final EIR that the city can work from that's as clean and clear as possible. Once the final EIRs, so there are several opportunities for public involvement in the process, such as tonight, and then as I mentioned, when the draft EIR is available for public review, we would present that to the Planning Commission and invite public comment in person that evening. Then there would also be project hearings regarding the environmental document as well as the project itself once the final EIR is complete. And as I mentioned previously, if the city finds that the EIR is complete and adequate, then then the city may certify the EIR, which is just another word for adopting it. It's the formal step that you go through under CEQA. And once the EIR is certified, then the city would be able to consider whether or not to approve the project. So I think that is, so our last two slides, just to reiterate, the intent of tonight's meeting is to hear from the public comments on what the scope of the EIR should be. So what issues need to be evaluated, what concerns people have about the potential for environmental effects. And then there's just some suggestions down here as to how the most effective way to phrase the comments. Again, because we're not interested at this time on debating the project merits, we really want to focus on, given what the project description is or what the project proposal is at this time, what issues does the EIR need to address to make sure that we've thoroughly captured the environmental effects. So finally, the comments, if obviously people are welcome to make their comments tonight verbally, but if people want to submit written comments, either in addition to the verbal comments or in place of them, they need to be addressed to Kathy, and her mailing address is here and her email address as well. And that information is also included in the notice of preparation, which is available on the city's website. So if you don't have time to write these all down right now. And that concludes the presentation, so I'd be happy to answer any questions from the commissioners or right before we move on to the public comment.
Okay, so before we open it up to the public, do you have any questions?
My only question at this point really has to do with sort of a 30,000-foot view of the project, and it sounds like we're going to go all the way through the EIR project before we even determine whether or not this body wants to issue a conditional use permit, which would be required for this project to go forward anyway. So all this money is going to get spent, all this studying is going to be done, and you don't even know whether or not we're going to issue a conditional use permit. I just question whether that's really smart.
That is a common struggle that the city the city is prevented from deciding whether you would like to issue a conditional use permit without having the EIR in hand, because the California Environmental Quality Act says that you cannot make that decision without knowing what your environmental effects are. So there is work done at the staff level, and Christina may want to jump in on this one as well, in terms of making sure that the project at least meets the city's codes and isn't something that you have no option to approve anyway, in terms of meeting your development standards.
Well, I'm not going to get into that tonight,
Yeah.
but I will say that the applicant has an opportunity, like any applicant, to do a study session before the Planning Commission if they so choose. It's a wonderful opportunity to have that type of conversation, and that's still an option that's available to them. But right now, we're proceeding with the environmental impact report.
Well, I'm going to just pursue something a bit along the lines of Commissioner Barbos. I know we're not here to discuss the merits of the project, and I just joined this commission this year. And this proposal came forth, from what I can tell, sometime in 2017 or 18, and there may have been modifications to it since then. It's unclear to me. I haven't been presented, nor have I been able to find what I would refer to as the customary administrative record associated with this project. I'm not even sure how it got to the point of the acceptance of the application. Now, you say you don't want to speak to that tonight, but it certainly seems to me that if a developer came forward and said, I want to build the Eiffel Tower on this parcel that's big enough to accommodate it, the city would say, well, I'm sorry, we don't build Eiffel Towers in Sonoma. And while that's an extreme example, the definition of this proposal, as I read it today, is completely out of compliance with our development code. In terms of lot coverage, it's not even close to the mark. So my question is, how did this process get this far that an EIR was even ordered if in fact, from the way I look at the proposal itself, I have a question as to why this was accepted as a valid application in the first place.
Christina, I can go. This application predates both Christina and I, but it's my understanding that it did come in quite a while ago. So anytime an application comes in, staff reviews it, and we prepare what's called a 30-day letter that outlines what's in the application and whether or not it meets code. And so I know that 30-day letter went out quite a while ago. The project was deemed complete by previous planners at the city. So right now, what our task is to review the project. We're early in the process. We will be working to review it for compliance. There is an opportunity that we'll work with if issues come up between now and the time the draft is completed. Some changes can be made to the project, but they can't be completely substantial, or we will have to reissue the notice of preparation. But we are in the process of reviewing it for compliance, and this is all information that will go into preparing the EIR, and ultimately that we'll be bringing forward to the commission.
Okay, well, to follow up on that, is that letter, that 30-day letter, something that can be made available
Yes.
to the commission?
Yes.
As well as, what I'd be looking for is as much history of the administrative record pertaining to this project as exists. If it were submitted as long ago as it appears to be, it would be under the jurisdiction of the previous planning director. I assume that there was some kind of communication, written and otherwise.
Yes.
I'd like to see what the discussion was to be able to better understand how it got to this point. And as I say, from my standpoint, got to this point and yet so far out of compliance with the development code. I don't get why the substantive issues that pertain to what I see as the deficiencies in this application haven't been addressed before we get to this point. That's where I'm confused.
Hi, I have a couple questions. One has to do, well, the follow-up with the letter of completeness. A project, help me understand, because I'm a little rusty on this, so this project's been along for a while. I don't know when it was actually submitted. What is the time frame and the time limit that an applicant has to start the process before it's deemed how should I put this? Like, there's like a statute of limitations that you have 45 days, or is there anything in the code that says you have to do something within so many days or within a year for it to fall out and it has to be resubmitted?
So I might ask Veronica to jump in. So we do have to do a 30-day letter that outlines compliance, but when you do an environmental impact report, that kind of resets the timeline because it's recognized that it does take a long time to do an EIR.
So there are some applicable time periods as respects the review of an application once it comes in. So an application comes into the city has a 30-day period within which to deem that application complete or incomplete. An application is not incomplete for failure to comply with the code if along with the application it requests either relief through a process in the code that would allow such relief to occur. By example, you had a project before you the other night that had a PD as an application to allow relief from certain standards. And while some of those standards were inapplicable for relief through the PD process, a PD process might be one way, say if you didn't want to meet setback, that you could alter the setback. So to the extent that another entitlement is required, the completeness review would say you're missing an entitlement. You need a general plan amendment. You need a change to setbacks for the following reasons, etc. Once completeness review is concluded, we have an additional 30-day period within which to do what's called consistency review, assuming that the project includes housing. So under the Housing Accountability Act, something we've talked about previously for previous projects, you have a 30-day review period for the staff to identify inconsistencies with the general plan or zoning ordinance and to provide those inconsistencies to the applicant. Again, the applicant may come back and say, I think those are waivable, or through a process I can deal with those, or they may resubmit and say, wait, we want to change our application. Subsequent to that process, we have a period of time within which to prepare whatever environmental document that what level of environmental document we intend to prepare. There is not currently a penalty for failure to meet that timeline, although some have been contemplated under some of the housing bills. At that point then, once the environmental document is concluded, as was described here tonight, you have a time period under the Permit Streamlining Act, once the document is certified, within which you must approve or deny the project itself.
I see, okay. So that's how the Streamlining Act mirrors into this process.
Correct.
I assume at some point an application was submitted with a project description. That's something that hasn't been shared with us. The more specific description of what I'm not going to call it a commercial component, but the community care or residential care component. One of the things that was unclear to me was the zoning, the mixed-use zoning, whether or not some things are allowed in the mixed use, some things are clearly not. Like a hospital would not be allowed on the mixed-use zone. So was there any discussion about like a general plan amendment or a change to the zoning itself specifically that may accommodate a quote-unquote like the project description? Because it's not clear to me whether it's a residential care or a community care facility, is it progressive care, is it, those all have different meanings, and they also are in our zoning code have different applicability. So was there a specific project description that could be shared with us so we understand what the project is?
So we have our general project description and then notice of preparation. And at this point, we are operating under it being a residential care facility, which would require a use permit. So we will work with the applicant to make sure that the project doesn't have medical care that falls into that other use category that you mentioned. So what you have right now is the general project description that we have, and as we go on, as DUDEC does the environmental work, planning staff will be walking through these and analyzing the project from a land use standpoint at the same time, kind of concurrently.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have
Just one follow-up, Veronica. Don't get up so fast.
Don't leave, okay.
If I understand what you said correctly, that an application can be accepted if there are mechanisms available to modify the customary terms in conditions that an approval would require. Now, my question is, what if there's no provision in the code to modify that allows for a particular proposal or component of a project that's being proposed? What if there is absolutely no mechanism in the code at all for modification of that? And along those lines, I would say the site coverage standard is exactly that. There's nothing I've been able to find in the code that says you can waive the site coverage standard. So how is that a modifiable condition? Why would an application be deemed complete if it is out of compliance with a non-modifiable condition?
So there are different mechanisms by which a condition can theoretically be modified. We talked about one of them, a PD process. This project did not elect to apply for a PD process. However, this project, as a residential project of proposing affordable housing, does have the opportunity to apply for concessions and incentives under state density bonus law.
They're not proposing affordable housing. They're required to have 5 affordable housing units as the inclusionary requirement. That's not something they're proposing. It's something that's required.
You are correct that it is something that is required, yet the applicant can, as a result of that requirement, apply for a concession or incentive under state density bonus law. They have the right to make that application.
Okay, so you're saying that for example, the lot coverage issue might be covered by a subsequent modification of the application for a density bonus?
Yes.
But is there anything else that you can imagine that would allow for that modification?
No.
Okay, thanks.
I have one more question. You said that one of the topics that was focused out of the EIR was the geology and soils topic, and you're citing the possibility of earthquakes and that type of thing. But given the fact that this property was used commercially, and I would expect that there ought to be some examination of the soil to make sure that there is not an issue with public health and safety. So I would like to hear your explanation on why you are not considering soils.
Sure. The soil, the potential for hazardous or contaminants to be in the soil would be considered under the chapter on hazards and hazardous materials. Okay. So that will be addressed.
Okay, so
yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? We will then go ahead and open it up for public to address us. Before we begin, I'm not going to limit you to 3 minutes, but I would ask you to be concise and to keep your remarks as brief as possible. And if I think that it's wandering off the subject or going on too long, I'll have to ask you to terminate your comments. But I don't want to put a restriction on you that you absolutely have to fall within 3 minutes. So with that, I would invite members of the public to step forward. Please state your name and address, and we'll get going.
My name is Kilby Stenkamp, and I live at 351 First Street East. And today we submitted, I'm with the North of the Mission Neighborhood Association, and today we submitted our perspective on the project and the scope. Was that received?
Yes.
Okay. It was a very thoughtful piece that we put together, and you guys have covered a lot of the topics. The question is, Dudak, you will receive a copy of that. Is that correct? Okay. So land use was one that you guys have brought up. Site coverage, the floor area ratio, parking, the density bonus concession, transportation and traffic, population and housing, the cultural and historic resource. Let's see here. Aesthetics, the project alteration, or alternatives, excuse me, and the hazardous materials. So we really put together a thoughtful piece, and we hope that you will consider it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments.
Good evening. Karen Skoogland, 126 Blue Wing Drive. I've only been in Sonoma for 12 years, but I've been paying attention to and have been involved mostly because of my neighborhood in issues before the Planning Commission. I don't ever remember this sequence happening before. So I'd be curious to know if any of you have ever looked at a project that was going to have an EIR done before there's ever even any consideration and study by the Planning Commission and from the public. I just think it's what if the EIR says it's fine to go ahead and build this, and then you take a look at it and you hear from the public that is really the wrong project for the neighborhood, then somebody has to come back with a new project. I just don't understand it. So if anybody wants to inform me more about this, I'd be happy to hear it. And I was just curious to know who chose the EIR consulting firm. Was that the city or was that the developer?
That was city staff. We
Okay.
went out to several firms and got scopes of work to look at doing the environmental impact report. And all of the firms that we looked at were very competitive, but we looked to DUDEC on their cost and on their experience, and that's how they were chosen.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Terry Burt, and I reside at 187 Guadalupe. I'm here on behalf of my neighbor who is unable to attend tonight. And my neighbor is Dick Peters, and Dick lives at 196 First Street East. And he does have some concerns, and he asked for me to present his concerns to you. The first one is he would like to see the properties remain as they are, enhanced and not torn down. He's concerned that the same owners are behind this project. The history with these owners were unpleasant, so he wants to know who owns the property now. The two-story structures will significantly impact Dick's own home and garden, which is just north of the property, and it will also negatively impact all the surrounding neighbors because of the little hangover. And I also noticed when you were talking about the surrounding properties, we're with the Spanish Pueblo units, which is right next to Meadow Gardens. So the rear part of that project literally impacts, it's right adjacent to our complex. So I want you to note that. And he had some comparables in regards to the assisted living in Sonoma. That was one of the concerns when you were talking about the lot, the size of the lot and the impact. So he wanted to point out the Brookdale one over on Oregon Street, which has a capacity of 153 people, and they're on a 5.46 acre lot. The other one is Sonoma Hills over on West MacArthur, which has 80 units located on 5.3 acre lot. And Avalon on 91 Napa Road with a capacity of 91 residents on a 3.28 acre lot. And he also would like to invite staff and commissioners when he gets home from the hospital, if you would like to go to his property and review the site plans, and he can explain more on how that would affect the property and the area. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Steve Eckert. I live in the Meadow Gardens condominiums on 2nd Street East. Is it possible to get an aerial photo up here? our concern, I'm following up on the previous commenter. Our concern is that we are going to have a 29-foot wall parallel to our lot lines. And we know that the property is going to get developed. We just want to make sure it's developed in a way that will impact us as least as possible. If we can get the aerial photo up, if you look at Spanish Pueblo and Meadow Gardens, you'll see that the buildings are skewed to the lot line. And that's to reduce the impacts of the neighbors. We've met with the representative in our yards, and we just got the feeling we were blown off when we told them about our concerns and said, look at what you're going to be doing to us. You're going to be blocking this view we've had. I've lived there for about 27 years, and we've had the luxury of the privacy and the quiet and the quality of life that comes along with an open lot next to you. And again, we know that the developer has a right to develop this. If you look at the site plans, the developer has carports in the middle of where the field is now. And he's sited these 29-foot square buildings into the corner of the lot, parallel to the lot lines. And so we think if he could site the parking structures next to the fence, or if he can't do that, make these, anything that abuts the fences by Spanish Pueblo and Meadow Gardens, one story, just like he did on First Street East. That's what he's proposing next to the single-family residence on First Street East, is the side that's abutting that property is one story. Now, if they can't do that, and for whatever reason, we ask them to skew it. So we're not looking at a 29-foot wall. And I'm sorry you couldn't get that aerial photo up there, but I'd like to submit this. I've included an aerial photo, and I've included a view of the field from our window. And again, we know that this guy has a right to develop his land, but we'd appreciate it if you would take a hard look at this and consider the neighbors that are immediately adjacent in the northeast corner of the project. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. Anyone else?
Good evening, Fred Allebach, 19550 8th Street East. I came here not knowing a lot about the project, and it seemed like more like a CEQA presentation than a presentation of the project. And I don't feel like I got a detailed look at what the project was at all tonight. So I think it was an inadequate presentation of it from the standpoint of a member of the public. And the public hearing should be a place where, you can see the whole project. And so how can you assess the impacts of the project if you don't see what the whole project is? So I think that was a deficiency in the presentation. Nevertheless, and I also agree with Larry and Steve about that the cart kind of seems like it got before the horse here. But nevertheless, I will talk about the alternatives here. And I think that the alternatives really point to having much more actual affordable housing than there is. We're not supposed to talk about the merits now. EIR is about environmental impacts, but then the EIR becomes the basis for going forward, and it creates a kind of sense of inertia. So if somebody gets an EIR passed, that's like the cow's already out of the barn. So it doesn't seem right in terms of the sequence of the process. I do it, like I said, I agree with Larry. And so I think that in Sonoma, what I keep seeing with projects that come forward, it seems like a parade of unaffordable market rate projects, just like one after the other, with the inclusionary requirement that then somehow is able to satisfy being affordable when it's just 20%. And so basically what that means is that every project, Sonoma gets 80% more unaffordable for everybody. So I think that you know, there's and so this project here has got 80 beds, but I've heard that that there's going to be $8,000 a month. So who could possibly afford that? And then 27 units when there could be, the existing code allows for 53 affordable units, and they've got 27. So I think, and then they got a density bonus concession for having the 5 affordable units included. And it just seems like that, and the Housing Accountability Act, seems like the applicant is trying to get what they want. And part of what's alternative. They showed project alternatives in the EIR, and it said that there's some alternatives here that do have more affordable units. And so that would conform to the land use part of the EIR, that this is an opportunity site here. And the EIR said land use, planning, population, and housing. And so the social environment here in Sonoma is important, and it's getting to be more of a monoculture. And this project adds to the environment of social inequity. So the environment is not just trees, but it's people and houses too. And so I think that there's an impact there that's needing to be assessed. And if the project isn't going to assess it now, it'll have to be later after people have spent a lot of money on the EIR and stuff. And so I think Sonoma's having its Housing Action Plan meeting tomorrow night. And the tide is kind of moving more towards actually affordable housing that people, you know, not market rate housing that most people can't afford. So I think that the alternatives need to be looked at, and the Planning Commission needs to be ready to pull the trigger to later when the project is under consideration to say this isn't what we want.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else?
I have one final question, if that's okay.
I'll give you permission to come up again.
Thank you. Kilby Stankamp again, 351 First Street East. On the EIR, does DUDAC take into consideration on the traffic impact the nature of the business?
Yes, so typically the traffic study is based on data either based on other similar types of uses or similar facilities, or we use the published trip generation rates for similar types of uses.
Okay, I actually talked to an assisted care facility and they sent me an email. We have so many people coming into our building daily. The need for parking is very evident. Between family vendors, visiting health professionals, consultants, performers, and staff, we have many people coming through our doors each day. So, okay, thank you.
Anyone else care to speak?
Hello, my name is Marilyn Good, and I think the planning department and planning staff is putting the cart before the horse. I think this city needs to radically think about getting rid of parking, getting rid of cars, and I think if you really restore, you start building all these things that are going to be antiquated within seconds. With so much waste of car use around here, that you need to really address that, because that's going to be the future very soon, I believe. Thank you.
Anyone else? Last chance. Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. We'll bring it back to the commission for any further comments.
I have a question. I think the comment about looking at alternatives has merit. I'm curious, is that something that is performed by the consultant?
Yes, typically I'll work with the city staff. So the CEQA provides some guidance as to how we should approach our alternatives analysis, excuse me. And typically what we do is we look at where did we find there could be significant impacts from the project, and what changes to the project could be made to avoid those impacts. So that's really the heart of the alternatives analysis, is to try and find ways to avoid or reduce the project's significant impacts. So what the actual alternatives look like, varies a lot from project to project, because it's very site specific and relates to the context of that, the planning setting for that particular project. But yes, we definitely consider altering the mix of land uses, reducing density. We even look at increasing density where that makes sense. So there are some projects where that applies. Not saying that this is one of them. So there's a lot of different considerations that go into how the alternatives are developed. But we certainly take any public comments that relate to those alternatives. We're going to take those and really look at those again when we get to that step in the process, to make sure that we're being responsive to the concerns that are raised.
Thank you.
This is a question and concern for staff. If I understand it correctly, this property is zoned as a mixed-use property, but it's also identified as a housing opportunity site. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and is there a natural hierarchy as to which of those takes precedence?
The general plan trumps the code.
And so the general plan is where the mixed-use zoning is included, or do I have it backwards?
Here, I'll let David.
So we have a couple of operating principles. We have the general plan, of which the housing element is where the housing opportunity sites are identified. I'm going to be wrong here, but I want to say there's like 20 of them that were identified with a certain amount of density and dwelling units that are there. And so when it comes to the general plan, the intent of the zoning code and the general plan is to talk to one another and be consistent with one another. So when we do permit a mixed use, it is consistent with the underlying general plan and the housing element.
Okay, well, the reason I raise the issue is this. I was on the city council when the mixed use zoning designation was created. Prior to that, it didn't exist. There was no such thing as mixed use zoning. There was just either housing or commercial, and that was it. The property in question was at the time occupied by Peterson Mechanical, who were operating as an ongoing commercial business in that location. And they had been there for quite a long time. And they raised the concern that if their property was rezoned to mixed use, that it was going to put them in a position of having a legal non-conforming use. Because the expectation from the city was that this was going to be a residential housing site, which is what most of the development in that area had been over the years. I mean, there are older uses in the neighborhood roughly, such as the Vela Cheese, and then Vintage House was built, which is in a strange kind of zone of its own. But obviously all the housing up into Blue Wing Drive and coming and down, and the development that the gentleman occupies who came up to speak, were all essentially the assumptions about the future. So as a concession to Peterson Mechanical, the property was zoned mixed use as opposed to residential. And that was to give them the opportunity to continue to operate as a commercial use. Now, had they not been occupying that space, if the commercial uses had not been in the picture at that time, there's no question in my mind that the city would have rezoned that parcel housing. And I think this is a significant point to recall, because it is actually the history of how that mixed-use designation ended up there. And I think that it points to, as far as I'm concerned, the hierarchy of the housing opportunity as a use of greater impact or import than the use of the property as a commercial purpose. I'm assuming that a facility like this is defined as a commercial purpose. It's not a, it's kind of a hybrid, you could look at it, but it's business. They are going to be taking in residents on a generally temporary basis, as these other facilities do, and there's going to be a certain amount of turnover, and it's a commercial operation. It'll be supported by a whole variety of vendors, not unlike a facility, for example, a hotel. They're going to have a food delivery. There's going to be a food delivery process. There's going to be a number of different vendors. There's going to be a lot of deliveries and trucks coming in. It's a provision of services business. That's I think there is some discussion that ultimately will have to be discussed in whether this is part of the EIR land use analysis. I hope it is, which is the highest and best use of this property from the standpoint of the community, as opposed to the return on investment for an individual property owner. So I just wanted to introduce that history of the mixed-use zoning into the discussion at this point, because I hadn't seen it reflected in any documents. Of course, I haven't seen any documents about this project and the discussions leading to how we've gotten to this point with it anyway, so hopefully this will be the beginning of an administrative record. Thank you.
I had a question. One question as a follow-up to Commissioner Barnett. And the public good, the highest and best use. Does the EIR process in this specific case look at socioeconomic, like socioeconomic analysis? I know that sometimes EIRs are like specific and they don't necessarily get into that, but in cases where communities are trying to look at the best land use and trying to weigh public housing versus, or affordable housing versus a commercial use. Is that included in the EIR?
So CEQA provides that we should not look at socioeconomic issues in an EIR unless they directly relate to a physical environmental change. So most commonly that's seen in terms of a large commercial development and whether it may draw activity away from an established commercial area and lead to urban, what we call urban blight. In the context of what you're discussing now, I think that the discussion will come into the land use chapter of the EIR, but also the population and housing chapter, because the site is recognized in the housing element as an opportunity site. That's where we'll definitely need to look at that and talk about the implications of changing that use. As is proposed.
And in terms of the scope or the overall analysis, we're looking at two separate, we're looking at one project, but there's two separate components to it. And one of the elephants or the white elephants in the room is the property line. So, and that is like a physical barrier in the sense of financing, the sale, how it's used. And so what are the constraints with respect to doing the analysis in the EIR? Do we have the ability to pretend that that property line doesn't exist? If we decide to look at like increasing the amount of housing and reducing the amount of residential care facility, I mean, what are the restrictions, and will those be discussed and set in the EIR's scope?
So what you're describing is more a land use issue that planning staff will look at in their analysis. There is a potential that the several lots could be merged into one lot, and so it would be one project on one lot, even though there's two different components.
So you're looking at it as one project. There's no constraint right now in terms of how you're analyzing like several components of a project, and the property line is the constraining factor in how you're looking at it.
So from a land use perspective, we are going to look at where those property lines are currently and make sure that the project individually meets site coverage and setbacks and all of that. As part of the project, they could request a lot merger to have one.
Because there's some aspects, it's unclear to me, as particularly as it relates to floor area, particularly as it relates to parking, that in some instances the criteria used is the whole amount of acreage, but then in some aspects it looks like they're looking at like parking, they're looking at it specifically as it relates to like a lot. One of the lots. And so does the EIR look at that in terms of like, you know, can it meet both tests, or does it, I mean, can they have their cake and eat it too, or they can like use the combined lot area for one and then use an individual size, the smaller lot to look at another standard, or how does that work?
So I will say that the EIR will look at land use and the conformity of the project to meeting the city's plans and policies. So there will be analysis in the EIR that looks at that. And then the specific components are what staff is going to look at individually, and that type of information will be presented to you in a staff report once we've done a thorough analysis in conjunction with the EIR. So I don't have the answers for you tonight on that, but we will be looking at it.
But you're going to look at both tests. Okay, thank you.
Steve? Well, I'll just sort of double back to where I started earlier. Is I just really think we have got this in the wrong order, and I understand that we're here to discuss the EIR. So in that context, I think the loss of housing opportunity in this case would result from a physical change, and I would encourage the study in the environmental impact report of the adverse effect on this community by the loss of very important housing stock so that this senior care facility can be built. That's just, to me, huge. That's the overriding, the most negative thing about this project is that it's causing our city to lose very valuable housing opportunity that it would otherwise have. And I don't understand how that can come to be. So in terms of alternatives, one alternative is obviously lose the senior living center and have more housing. That's the best alternative for this project. As it's construed, I just wonder if the people that designed this and are talking about building have ever been over there when there's a Little League game in process, or the Friday Farmers Market. To treat the traffic as a non-issue is really not accurate. I mean, it's tough to get a place to park as it is right now on a Friday morning, and there's a Little League game. There's a lot of kids running back and forth across that street, balls flying out of the ballpark. It's a very hazardous traffic area, so much so that the parents over there put those little things up in the street to stop people from driving, except at a very slow rate and using part of the lane. So traffic really needs a close look, and not your routine cookie cutter, off the shelf traffic study that we've all seen that can justify just about anything. But I mean a site-specific, use-specific look at this traffic and parking from the standpoint of what's on the ground on this property, because this is not a good idea. I think those are, and obviously, I understand a phase 1 environmental impact report or study has been done on this, but given the history of the use, the tanning, the Peterson Mechanical obviously there's a huge potential for hazardous materials on site, which really needs to be looked at in this study. That's my comments.
Through the chair, are we just still asking staff questions, or are we providing specific comments about the scope of the environmental review?
You can go comments.
Okay, I have a few more. But I don't want to.
No, we're back to
questions.
our discussion, questions, comments, whatever guidance we can give them.
Okay.
Well, Robert, if that's the case, I'd like to at least speak. You guys are all talking heavily about the project, but you're not giving the applicant to discuss some of those key topics, like how senior living is housing, how 80 seniors.
You'll have to approach the microphone, and I understand your concern. I was told by staff that you didn't want to make a presentation tonight, but I will reopen the public hearing and allow you to make comments if that's your desire now.
Thanks, Robert. I appreciate that. I mean, certainly that. My name is Jason Reyes. I'm the developer of the property. I also own and operate several communities throughout Northern California for assisted senior living. And I think probably one of the disappointing things from this perspective is a lot of public comment on not the EIR. I wasn't planning on giving any sort of conversation today, but because we're getting so much bad information from, quite frankly, some of the council members, the commissioners here, I just feel like I should come up and talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions, such as we're not a hotel. We're also providing homes for senior living. This isn't taking away housing. These residents don't go home at the end of the day. They're 80 years old. Most everybody in this room at some point is going to need some form of senior assisted care. This isn't, they come in and show up and vendors come in and then they leave. They live there. I mean, this is people's homes. I mean, if you've never been to one of my communities, I certainly encourage you to show up and take a look at it, because it's not a hotel. And, in terms of, being a baseball park across the field, my residents don't drive. They're 85 years old on average. Single, widowed women who need help. They need help with things like bathing and dressing and people preparing them meals. But what you're talking about right now is not supporting senior residential housing, because that's what this is. This is where seniors live. And you have a community in Sonoma who desperately needs it. And you talk about the location. I mean, this property is right next door to the only senior community center in Sonoma. It really couldn't be any better of a location for this project, just given the synergies. I'm sure anybody who's seen the baseball games over there, given that population, is probably because they were at the senior community center at some point in time. This has nothing to do with kids being across the street. This has nothing to do with taking away your housing. We are providing more housing, and we're providing it for the senior citizens of this community. And I think it's a shame, I think it's shameful to say that you want to stop housing for seniors. Thank you.
Could we ask a question? How much are people going to pay to live there a month?
Absolutely. And I have a community that is 25 minutes away. You can have a studio for $3,100 a month. Includes all your housekeeping, your laundry, your food, your meals, your entertainment, 24-hour support by caregivers and med techs. And again, a family business. I was raised in Solano County. I spent my whole life there. So this is something that if you look at somebody, and let's talk about that, because that was a very good, important question. So there's a few things that you should know. So in terms of senior care communities, there's VA assistance. Work very closely with all my vets to make sure that the VA will help kick down money. Do you know the VA can kick down as much as $2,800 per month for not only a vet, but also a surviving spouse of a vet? And so we work to make sure that things are affordable. I'm not a big conglomerate company. I don't say, hey, it's $3,500 a month and otherwise you don't get to move in, or if they run out of money, I kick them out. This is a family business. I work with people all the time. I work with vets, I work with family members. What we do is we make it as affordable as we possibly can. And if you look at even $3,500 a month, you take somebody's mortgage, you take all the food that they take, you take all their utilities, all that's included in the cost. So we don't go out of our way to try to make a ton of money. It doesn't work that way. We're here to take care of our seniors, give them a place to live. And if that wasn't the case, all your communities in town wouldn't be 98% full, 99% full waiting lists at these places. There's people in this room who are going to need this care, and you're not going to have anywhere to go. You're going to have to go to Fairfield. You're going to have to move out of your own town because there's not going to be anybody here to take care of you. And you want to talk about affordability? You know what it costs to get a caregiver to come to your house? You might think, oh, I'm not leaving my house. I'm going to have a caregiver come to my house. 24 hours, you could talk about $20,000 a month. You want to talk about not affordable? Let's talk about that, because that is not affordable. What I provide is an opportunity for seniors who have little money to lots of money to be able to enjoy and be able to live in a community. You know, they get to be, and not only live in a community, they're right next door to the Vintage House senior community. So we get to interact, all of our seniors together in one location and provide houses for them, homes where they live. And it's not temporary. They don't come in and die in a week. My average resident lives there for 5 years. I just think that was very shameful for you to say. That hurt my heart when you said that. You made a joke out of it, and that was very, very distasteful.
Is that the range of rents you're talking about here?
That's correct. We haven't, again, we're trying to first get somebody to open up their eyes and their hearts about what's really needed in this community. But yes, you have my full guarantee that I'm going to work within reason of every single ounce of my body to make sure that we have people here that can afford it. And if I don't do that, nobody will move in. How would that help anybody? How would it help for me to build something that nobody can afford to live in? I don't have 5 units, I have 80 units. And I need to find 80 people in this community. 99% of my residents will come within a 5-mile radius. They will all be citizens of Sonoma. And if I can't make it affordable, how does that help me? How does that help anybody? They will be affordable to the point where I guarantee in a year there'll be a waiting list, and people and my building's not enough. My building's only 1. You need 3 times the size of my building to even begin helping the citizens, the senior citizens who need help here.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Since I have reopened the public hearing, if anybody else would care to speak now, you're welcome to come up to the microphone.
Can't resist another opportunity to comment here. I think that the applicant's presentation here underlines how the presentation today was not complete. And this reminds me of a cannabis hearing that I went to with the Sonoma Valley Citizens Advisory Commission, where the applicant came and said a whole lot of things that weren't in the staff report. But that can't be the basis for the project. The statements sound good, but they need to be quantified, and they need to be on paper that the rents are such and such, and this is the range of them, and how many studios, what is the range in there. So these are the things that need to be quantified to be able to assess the goodwill of the project. And so we haven't seen that, and so I think that's important as far as the putting in context the comments from the commission here, is that the inadequate presentation of the project and asking people to just focus on CEQA when the project itself hasn't been laid out just doesn't make sense. So I can understand that the applicant's frustrated because people are saying things, but that seems to be how this process is. And it's unfortunate that it is like that. But I would like to see those statements about what the range of affordability is quantified in a staff report or from the applicant. And he said he would guarantee that. And so I would like to see that, because that would change the whole nature of it. You know, because my mom's in assisted living in New Jersey, and she pays nearly $5,000 a month for a studio, and that's in rural New Jersey. And this is one of the most expensive places to live in the United States. So if you're going to get like $1,500 less than that a month, that would be a great deal. So people would be coming to Sonoma to go there. So I'd like to see just some of these things quantified so we know what we're getting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, George Weiss from 295 5th Street West. Since the subject of traffic seems integral to this CEQA issue, 2 things. The senior assisted living facility, 80 residents don't drive. The employees that take care of those 80 people drive a lot. They generally don't work 40-hour weeks. They work short shifts. So there are a lot of employees coming and going all the time when you start looking at traffic. The other big thing that you don't mention, Steve, excuse me, is Vintage House. Okay, I've been the instructor for senior safe driving at Vintage House for 25 years. A lot of traffic of senior drivers coming into that, out of that driveway at Vintage House. And there again, it's an atypical traffic situation that I think the consultants need to focus on. Little understood statistic on senior drivers. We get better insurance rates because we have fewer wrecks, because we drive way fewer miles. The crashes per mile for senior drivers, starting about 60, starts going up and up rapidly. And that's because our reflexes aren't as good, our eyesight is not as good, our hearing is not as good. So the drivers going in and out of Vintage House for their extensive program assortment is a very atypical traffic situation, and something that, in addition to the baseball field, needs a lot of attention. Thanks.
Thank you, George. Last chance for this before I close the public hearing again. Seeing no one approach, we're back to the commission for any final remarks, discussions, whatever.
Oh, well, can I finish what I was going to say? Okay, so I'm going to be more mundane and talk about some of the ideas that should be discussed in the EIR. So I was going to go down through those. One has to do more specifically with traffic. I just want to make sure that the internal traffic circulation, specifically loading and unloading, both for services and also for guests, is actually looked at and adequately analyzed in the EIR, and I'm sure it will, but I just wanted to make sure that there's a distinction between people coming, going in the front versus people coming and going in the back. And also an analysis of all of the driveways. Right now, the proposal has a series of driveways along First Street East, and I want to just make sure that there's not an opportunity lost for consolidation of those driveways and reducing the amount of traffic impacts or pedestrian impacts as it relates to that sidewalk, because it's heavily traveled. And so the reduction of driveways, I remember talking with JJ, who was a consultant, and looking at this year or two back when he was trying to figure out what the completeness items would be. And one of the things that I did bring up was my concern about the number of driveways that this project does have. And then in terms of alternatives, I believe with my other fellow commissioners, we need to look at an alternative that has a 100% housing component to it, to address the idea and the concept that in the general plan that there's a the housing opportunity site, and we also need to look at the environmental impacts related to giving that up as it relates to the housing element. Then the other thing was the whole issue with the alternatives, reductions in parking versus increasing floor area, what is the most advantageous for the city and the public as it relates to alternatives, because right now we have a project, it appears to me, that doesn't meet the floor area. But they're using that as the analysis for the one waiver. But we could also look at reductions in parking. I know that members of the public have talked about concerns about parking with respect to the care facility, but there certainly could be, say for example, in the residential component, the 27 units, a reduction in parking there, and flexibility in allowing, looking at floor area if we were reducing parking for the residential component, and then also maybe even looking at the residential component as a senior, like 55 years and over complex versus a mixture of ages, because that might also give us the justification for reduction in parking. In terms of the visual analysis, I think members of the public were talking about the views and the visual aspects as it relates both looking through and looking at the property. And I think that in this case, and in the past, we've seen virtual model. And so I think my fellow commissioners would agree that that should be something that should be a component in the EIR. And I'm not talking about a static perspective. We have the technology now, and we have the capability of having three-dimensional aspects that can be downloaded and shared to the members of the public, and that is something that I would highly encourage the consultant to do. And then also something that I also is a passion of mine is the solar exposure. We need to look at the green aspects of this and look at energy use. And this care facility is going to be using a lot of energy, and I want to make sure that there's a discussion about energy efficiency and the use of solar. Lastly, has to do with the other projects that we reviewed on the site having to do with the trees along the senior center, and this project, and the need to preserve that tree canopy to create a buffer between the two properties and to be able to preserve those trees. So I want to make sure that when we're doing the analysis for the vegetation, that we're looking at all the best alternatives to preserve as many of those mature trees as possible. So, thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to do anything else?
He's anxious.
I'll be quick. Mr. Reyes, I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have treated lightly the subject of people coming and going in your facility. So that was a mistake, and I do apologize. I've had two family members who were in assisted living facilities and ended their lives there. I agree with you that this is an essential component of the community and in an increasing need for the community. There's no doubt about that. My concern is simply a matter of the land use, whether this is the right place for a facility like this, whether the facility as it's been presented to us, and I'm admitting I am frustrated by coming into this process at this stage in something that apparently goes back 2 years, about which essentially I've learned nothing. So this is an odd circumstance. I'm looking at the land use impacts. I'm looking at the applicability of a project like this in that location. I have no argument with you about the need for facilities like this in Sonoma. You are absolutely correct. I just don't know if, as proposed, this is the right spot, designed in the right way for this particular location, and I wish that it would be possible to have had that discussion in more depth before you have to foot the expense of an EIR, which I think is an odd circumstance that we're this far down the line without having the essential discussion about should this be a housing opportunity site and what does that mean and how do we define it. So that said, thank you.
Question for the consultant. On the two existing houses, it was noted that there's going to be an additional peer review. Is that correct? And are those houses going to be evaluated from a historic standpoint, from an architectural standpoint, recognizing that they are, in terms of the inventory of Sonoma, somewhat unique.
So yes, we're DUDEC has architectural historians and archaeologists on staff, and they are working on a brand new historic resources evaluation. So there was a historic resource evaluation prepared several years ago. I don't remember the date. And then that had been, the public comments had been submitted, sort of peer reviewing or critiquing that report. So our historians have reviewed all of that information, but they are taking a completely fresh look, so that this is they're not following one side or the other. They're putting their own professional judgment to determine whether any of the buildings on site retain any historic significance.
Thank you.
Further questions or comments? I guess just listening to the conversation here, especially given the fact that we have a rather new makeup of the commission, I hope that staff will try to get us as much information about the project itself in whatever form it has been presented, and in terms of what it was judged in the 30-day letter to be complete, so that we have that information. And it does seem a little bit too far down the road, but I guess I would also like to have you pursue with the applicant whether there's a need or a desire to have another study session of sorts in front of the Planning Commission before we get too far down the road on an EIR, so that we have a better understanding of what actually is proposed and whether that does fit the general plan and code. That's all I think we have up here. Do you have any further comments from staff as to need for direction?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment. First of all, directing to every member of the public, the scoping portion is open. We will be accepting comments until July 15th. Today is not your only opportunity, so we have access via email, use snail mail, so that comment period is open to everyone until that point. I would also like to take a moment to address some of the comments about the content and the project description up at this point. First of all, what the scoping session is supposed to be a very focused meeting. This is not a planning commission hearing where you would typically get a packet of information full of all the project plans and an analysis from staff. So that was on purpose. That's not the point of this hearing. The point of this hearing is to solicit feedback from the public and to give them an opportunity to comment on the scope of the environmental report. Always our project files are available at City Hall, and everyone is welcome to give us calls, and we're happy to give you as much information as possible. The narrative, the project plans are available online, and I'm happy to send anybody the link. The next step in the CEQA process is to prepare a full project description, and so once that's prepared, that is really where a lot of these questions are going to get answered, and that just hasn't happened yet. The first step is to do the scoping.
Mr. Chair and Commissioners, I also need to apologize because we're here tonight, and I apologize because I had to step out to take care of a personal matter, and I don't know if it was said, so if it was said, I'll be happy to sit down. But the City of Sonoma has not had a practice of having scoping sessions in front of the Planning Commission on a singular night dedicated only for that purpose. We have seen that they've been done in the past, but they've not been done in this particular form, and it was a staff desire to get in front of the commission because we can clearly prepare an EIR without coming to a planning commission or even having a scoping hearing or a scoping session. We're capable of doing that. We have the skill and the technology, and the people here can certainly do that. But as a choice of staff, we wanted to get this project, because of its history, in front of the commission so that the public and yourselves could inform and instruct the components of what we're going to be in the EIR. For example, all of the things you talked about tonight: population, housing, employment, those kind of things, aesthetics, perfect stuff to embody, and I think we've heard that message loud and clear. Yes, there'll be a traffic analysis, but that's related to just the EIR. And as you all know, we have to first take a look at the project through the environmental lens, and then you get to decide whether you like the project. Is that environmental document adequate in identifying all of the environmental effects of that project? and then we kind of wrap it up, address it, certify it or not certify it as being adequate, and then we get onto the merit of the project. So our goal is to try to get you an environmental document that does all of the things that you've talked about tonight and that of the public. And again, I do want to emphasize that we'd love to see comments in writing to us before the July 15th deadline. And thank you for your comments tonight.
Thank you, David. With that, I think I'm going to close this item, 6.1. And so, David, do you have any issues update?
No, sir, but we would love to see everybody here in the room tonight over at Vintage House between 6 and 9 p.m. tomorrow night. Thank you.
Other comments from the commission?
Because of the town hall that you spoke about at the beginning of the meeting, Mr. Chair, sorry.
Yes. I'll entertain, do you have comments from the commissioners rejoining? Not about this subject we just talked about, but.
No comments.
Okay.
And just thank you to everyone who came out tonight. It's so great to have all the neighbors here and participate.
With that, I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Adjourned.